If you've seen Disney's 1951 animated classic Alice in Wonderland, then you probably remember the famous scene in which she falls down the rabbit hole, which itself has become a kind of shorthand for delving into the unknown. So it's totally appropriate that the instant she crosses the threshold from the real world into Wonderland, we hear this familiar musical cliche. And what you're hearing is the whole tone scale, and it's very often used as a musical device in any story involving a dream sequence or some other transition into the otherworldly. In this video, we're going to go down our own musical rabbit hole, and I'll show you why this specific set of notes is objectively the sound of dreams. So let's get into it on the art of storytelling. So let's begin with a simple major scale. And one thing you'll notice when you hear this collection of notes is that they come home to a feeling of resolution. There's one note in the scale that feels perfectly resolved, and I can demonstrate that by not quite making it to the end of the scale. And just pay attention to how this creates an expectation in your mind that is not fulfilled. Now you can hear that ability to resolve even more clearly if I clump the notes in the scale together into chords and create chord progressions that also lead to home. That home note has many names. It's called the tonic or the key center or the root. It's basically the do in do, re, mi. And you can think of it as a kind of musical anchor or center of gravity. And most scales in the Western system of music have this anchor, whether they're major or minor or anything else. And that is why nearly all of the music that you hear has an emotional quality to it. It's because all these scales have a built-in structure that is capable of expressing tension and resolution. Now this is where one might start to assume that this ability to become tense and then resolve is simply an inherent property of all music. That is not so. The whole tone scale has the rare quality of not having a home note. And if you're saying, well, the scale still has an ending, so the last note that you play in the scale is the home note, listen to what happens if the scale keeps going. Do you hear a resolution in there? Every note feels like it could be the home note, which means none of them is really the home note. And what happens if I try to play chords in this scale and try to make a nice chord progression that has a feeling of resolution? The point is that it's actually impossible to create tension or resolution like we could with the other scales. There's a nice little demonstration of this distinction when Alice falls further down the rabbit hole. The sequence begins with her in total darkness, and the musical underscore there sounds totally ambiguous. It doesn't have a tonal center. But when she switches on a lamp, the chord that plays does have a tonal center. If I just isolate that chord, you can clearly hear it has that home note. This gets even more interesting when you begin to understand the reason why the whole tone scale can't resolve, and a clue can be found in its name. The scale is created by simply playing notes that are evenly spaced a whole tone apart. All I'm doing here is skipping every other note on the keyboard. In other words, every note in the scale has the exact same relationship to its neighbor, which makes it very different from other scales. The major scale has an asymmetrical pattern of whole steps and half steps. And that means it contains information that your brain can interpret to kind of predict what you're going to hear next. And the whole tone scale, on the other hand, is perfectly symmetrical. There's no information for your brain to interpret. It's just an evenly repeating set of notes with no pattern to guide your ear towards any kind of resolution. And this means that the whole tone scale doesn't have any musical function. It has no expressive potential. It's kind of interesting because it's neither resolved nor tense. It's just a kind of musical netherworld in which there's no musical meaning. And that makes it totally useless for creating emotion unless the feeling that you want to capture is that feeling of being in limbo. The composer Claude Debussy famously used the whole tone scale to subvert the conventions of his era and create so-called impressionistic music that seemed to float in tonal ambiguity. And you will occasionally hear it in popular music as a kind of jazz harmony. Some of of the earliest examples of it being used as a storytelling device can be found in the work of Alfred Hitchcock, who created several memorable dream sequences. Check out this one from Spellbound.
It seemed to be a gambling house.
This scene was actually designed by Salvador Dali to portray the unconscious mind under psychoanalysis. Really a perfect fit for the whole tone scale. You might be wondering if there's a half-tone scale in which you just play all of the notes on the keyboard, and yes, this is called the chromatic scale, and it is sometimes used in dream sequences like this one in Vertigo. This scale also cannot resolve, but it has a different flavor. It's kind of like just mashing your hands on the keyboard to create maximum dissonance. So it's a much darker kind of musical ambiguity. It doesn't really have the spaciness that the whole tone scale does. Today, the whole tone scale is basically a musical meme. It's usually heard when somebody spirals into the unknown, which makes sense given its cyclical nature and its disorienting effect. And this cultural association might lead you to believe that the only reason that the whole tone scale sounds dreamy is that we're just accustomed to hearing it in this context. But the point of this video is to show that music also has certain intrinsic properties that can make it more or less suited to conveying a particular idea or feeling. And these are not always man-made cliches. The whole tone scale is objectively ambiguous and has sounded dreamy ever since the first time it was heard, long before Alice went down the rabbit hole. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you on the next one.